Today we are going to talk about the middle current, the one that Rudolf Steiner and Christian Rosenkreuz and Christian Rosenkerner. It is this current that has caused me the most puzzlement. When the first two currents appeared before my eyes, I knew that there must be a third. A current in the middle, which is connected with the salvation of the human soul. But not. I didn't know which of the great leaders of humanity was connected to it. Rudolf Steiner's two statements have guided me. One goes back to Walter Johannes Stein. 38, when Stein was preparing to teach the 11th grade of the first free Waldorf school for the first time. He once said to Rudolf Steiner, "The longer I deal with Parsifal, the clearer it becomes to me how important individuality is." Rudolf Steiner confirmed this. Stein went on to ask, "Is it as important as Zarathustra or Scythianos?" "Oh no," replied Rudolf Steiner, "much higher." This posed a big question for Stein. But for me it was a hint that there was clearly an intellectual current that had influenced even greater epics, such as Zarathustra. I found a second reference in a lecture given by Rudolf Steiner in Berlin on November 11, 1904, entitled Manu and Manichism. Right at the beginning of the lecture Rudolf Steiner says, "The roses are the even more important spiritual current than the Rosicrucian current was Manichism." 39, so here again was a wind. Again, there was a new spiritual current, obviously even more comprehensive than the ones we know. Then I asked him today, where is the connection between Parsifal and Manichism? Finally, I came across the personality of Manu. And when I looked into what Rudolf Steiner had said about Manu, it became clear to me that we are talking about the most important leader of mankind. Manu has been with humanity since the middle of Lemurian times and has gone through every step of evolution that humanity has experienced since then. It has always been his task to help humanity to find the right balance between good and evil. He founded the Atlantean solar mystery. Hermes and Zarathustra are two of his disciples, whom he prepared for their leadership roles in the post-Atlantean era. This is in line with Rudolf Steiner's statement about the individuality of a person who, in his spiritual development, Zarathustra in his own development. Manu was called in those ancient times the divine Manu. The self-activity of humans were not yet so strongly developed, so the direct influence of the gods was still possible and even necessary. Even possible. Although Manu himself was human, he could act as an intermediary between humans and the gods. The divine hierarchies worked through him. We know that at the end of the Atlantean period Manu gathered around him a group of people who were already showing the first signs of individual, independent thought. With these people he moved eastwards. He led the nucleus of this group to the Thermidans, which was then a large inland sea. Was a small island. Here he waited until the time was ripe for the first post-Atlantean, pre-Indian, era to begin. It was he who initiated the ancestors of this Indian culture, the seven rishis. He did the same. Zarathustra, the inspirer of the second post-Atlantean age of the old Persian culture, and Hermes, the first god of the ancient Indian culture, the founder of the Oiptian culture. I have already mentioned Rudolf Steiner's statement that the divine Manu once became the human Manu. Then he will no longer be guided by hierarchies in the old way, but will come to knowledge by his own power. By its own power. Personally, I am of the same opinion, but there is no reference to this in Rudolf Steiner's work that Manu's function as the divine Manu was introduced in Egyptian culture. In the ancient Egyptian culture. Then, I think, a new incarnation cycle begins for him, in which he prepares for his task as human Manu. In a sense, he has to start all over again. One of his early incarnations in this new series is the Nani youth, who dies and is awakened by Christ. He is the first man to receive Christ's initiation, performed by Christ himself as initiator. The second man to receive such an initiation is Lazarus, who is the same as the Apostle John. Probably, unfortunately, no one has ever asked Rudolf Steiner the question of what became of the young Nain, and there is no further reference to this. But, given the fact that he is the first to have been initiated into Christ, we can assume that he is deeply involved in deeply connected with the Christ being. A later incarnation is Manu or Manes, who was tempted by Christ in the 3rd century after Christ to recrystallize the then decadent Persian Zoroastrian religion of Zoroaster. He was the epitome of Manichaeism. Founder of Manichaeism. Mani was born in 215 AD to poor parents in what is now Iran, what was then Persia. During his mother's pregnancy, his father was given the task through dreams to leave the family. He then went to the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to join a certain sect there. Mani is born, he is once again the widow's son. His mother is so poor that she can't carry him. And Mani is sold at the age of 7, as was the custom at the time. So he becomes a slave to a rich widow. This mistress soon recognizes the talents of the boy, then called Corbisius. Eventually she adopts him. When he is 12 years old, the widow dies and he inherits not only his earthly fortune, but also his Scythianos, 4 books which belong to her. It turns out that this is the Scythianos we know about, who, at the beginning of the 2nd century, traveled as a merchant between Scythia and Egypt, teaches this woman as her teacher. During his travels he stayed at the widow's house. Mani begins to study these books and soon has his first encounter with an angel, whom he calls Eltawan. This literally translates as companion. From that moment on, this angel is always near him. When Mani turns 18, she gathers a group of disciples around him. Now she gives herself the name Mani. A few years later, he decides to spend a year in a full-time job in solitude for a year. He discovers a cave with a well and says to his disciples, now he is a Mani. You will not see me for a year. In absolute darkness is the first experience of Christ, like Paul in Damascus. In the darkness of the Christ in Damascus, there is a doctrine, which includes all the stages from Saturn to volcano. The character of this doctrine is that its overall developmental pictures are always set in a dichotomy of light and darkness. Mani is, after all, Persian, who lived in the late heyday of Zoroastrianism. In Zarathustra, everything is a combination of good, Ahura Mazda, and evil, Ahriman. However, this doctrine and the cultic practices that go with it date back to the decadence. For example, priests now called themselves magicians rather than priests. This is the beginning of true Manichaeism. In a very short time Mani had a huge army of followers. He founds a school, produces writings and spreads his doctrines throughout Persia and India. If one moment he is in a royal court, the next, through the machinations of magicians, he is driven away. During his wanderings, he also touches terramidants. Everywhere he goes, he founds communities. Himalayas. There was a Manichaean empire until 1200 AD. It is known that in the 7th century and 8th centuries, all kinds of cultures, Buddhist, Islamic, and Manichaean, lived peacefully along the Silk Road. Coexisted in Manichaean and Manichaean coexistence. Mani eventually dies in 276. At this time he is in the court of the Persian king, where the magician, accused of treason, he is said to have betrayed the Persian religion. He is sentenced to death and a horrible death sentence. executed with terrible cruelty. But Manichaeism spreads in the following centuries, from Gibraltar to the and extending deep into the Chinese Empire. The Roman Church always tried to eradicate this movement with fire and iron. Even a short time ago, the whole of Rome. Our knowledge of Manichaeism was based on the writings of Augustine. Augustine was a Manichaean novice, but he knew only the outward aspects of this religion. He did not reach the higher degrees. Then he turned away from Manichaeism and became an outright enemy of this doctrine. 40. In the 30s of the 20th century, old Manichaeist writings were discovered in a Coptic monastery. Books were also found on the other side of the Himalayas, but they were written in a dialect that only a few specialists could understand. Only a few specialists could decipher. It therefore took 30 years for the content of these books to be generally accepted. Accessible to the general public. Egon Roll's book Mani, The Messenger of Light, is based on the latest knowledge of the subject, which, moreover, largely coincides with Rudolf Steiner's depictions. He draws a picture of Mani and his. If one asks oneself what is the essence of Manichaeism, one can answer in 2 sentences. Can be summed up in 2 words. The first is this: all light creates shadows. Or, to put it another way, if you are a man of light, you are a man of light. If we do something good, we also create a shadow of that good. For example, if a group of people finds an ideal form of cooperation, it will find that this form is in a next stage of development, it suddenly becomes an obstacle. Such a form can be a huge obstacle to the development of new forms of cooperation. Innovations that are essential at that moment. We will always come into conflict with the shadow that we ourselves have created when we do something good. We cannot ignore this shadow. On the contrary, we must take it with us into our development. Another basic idea of Manichaeism: the shadow of good must be met with gentleness. Not with anger and violence, but gentleness. Developing good in the face of evil is what Manichaeism is all about. Manichaean way. Love and goodness, gentleness, are the forces that save the human soul. If man takes a step forward in his development, the consequence is that the situation of people who are backward becomes even darker. The way of the Manichaeans is characterized by: at a certain stage of their lives they devote themselves entirely to their own development, only to return to the poorest and go on with them. This Manichaean principle is the cornerstone of all social life, of all social work. All progress creates darkness. It is therefore necessary to return to the darkness again and again. Not with hatred and anger, but with gentleness and love. These 2 words, gentleness and love, are of crucial importance. In the Manu current, and Manichaeism is one of the manifestations of this current. Because Manu mission is to save the human soul. I have already said that the human spirit is untouchable and the counterpowers have therefore cast their net on the human soul. The human soul is the battleground between good and evil. Between the forces of good and evil. They attempt to darken and even destroy the human soul, so that the human self cannot gain experience through it. If we look now at the anthroposophical movement, we have to say, unfortunately, that gentleness and love is not always predominant. There are, however, many in the anthroposophical movement who are Manu's way. Of course, we must not make the mistake of thinking that what we want to do is not what we want to do. Developed by Mani in Persian culture is as significant in the present as it was then. It is about the basic features, and they have remained unchanged. It is in therapeutic pedagogy that we encounter Manu's influence. If we consider that 20-30 years, people in their 30s, often spend a precious part of their lives, perhaps 10 years, just to get some back. children left behind. These people give up many of the pleasures of life and go to sleep. Trying to take a special education child one small step further. This sacrifice. Even if many sensible people say, "Stop it, you have achieved nothing," they keep going. Back then, when I was introduced to anthroposophy, I was convinced that I was going into a scientific career. Everything was already prepared. When I finished my studies, I had in my pocket a promise of a cancer research institute in Amsterdam. So I was well on my way to becoming a researcher. But when I knew that this was the path for me. Anyway, in a rather strange way, I founded institutions and worked as a doctor in special needs education. But I never lived and worked with a group of children in special education for more than 7 years. But I have helped to make it happen. To get to know them. And from that you can see how the different streams intersect. The soul is in danger and Manu's job is to save the soul. We can see this even when we can follow another of his activities here on Earth. Soon after his death, Manu is apparently back on Earth. Those who know Rudolf Steiner know that after Christ in the 4th century there was a kind of spiritual synod in which of some of the great leaders of mankind, Manu, Zarathustra, Scythianos and another personage whom the Buddha had strongly inspired by the Buddha. Steiner says of this gathering that it was a turning point in the development of humanity. The greatest spiritual gathering in the history of mankind. A synod where only 4 individualities participated. Discussed the strategy of the good powers in their struggle against evil until the end of the Earth's evolution. 42. The next major incarnation of Parsifal. He was the first human to undergo a complete evolution of consciousness, of soul development. This can be clearly recognized if one observes the difference between Manu and Parsifal. As Manu developed unimaginably high wisdom, this individuality, as Parsifal, as a pure sucker. Parsifal is born without knowledge. He has to start all over again and will be at his own expense. Wise. This is an important characteristic of the conscious soul. We know this from our own lives, nothing is predetermined. We all have to go through the ground zero of life's realities. We will be at our own peril. Wise, we are all Parsifals. We are fools, ignorant of our past incarnations, our purpose in life. We don't even know what we're supposed to be doing here, we don't know how to do it. We don't know who we are, we just stand still and do something. Parsifal gradually understands what his job is as the story unfolds. It is Parsifal who can be seen. How right Rudolf Steiner was when he said that it was important to know what spiritual current one is in. Only in the second phase of his life was Parsifal able to carry out his task in a truly conscious way. Consciously. For that is the only way in which man can fulfill his task of cognition. To know what his task is. But the conscious man must first seek it. The strangest things must happen, the most erratic wrong turns must be taken. But he who perseveres will one day say, I'm a Rosicrucian, a representative of the Manu current, or a representative of Rudolf Steiner's mission. Of Rudolf Steiner. And I repeat once again, of course, all 3 traits can be found in every human being, but it's about discovering where the center of gravity is. People who belong to the Manu current feel a deep need to help those who are unfortunate or have difficulties. They want a piece of their own karma and they know to offer out of love to others. This can definitely be seen in therapeutic pedagogy. I have already said that. If you look around at how young people give up a good few years of their lives to live with children in need, then we know what Manu is like. I have a great respect for those who take such things upon themselves. Often simple-minded souls. which means that they are seen as incapable of anthroposophy. Intellectually, I have often had to defend these people, who are in the real bearers of the work of therapeutic education, against the so-called anthroposophists who have everything so neatly in their heads. In their heads. Sometimes, a member of staff in a special education institution could not admonish to write an intellectual report on the development of a special education child. So, for example, a teacher who was considered so inadequate for this job, I would say, I wish the so-called anthroposophists had at least as much love as these so-called naive people have. I would like to think that this is the kind of humanity that I would like to have. The people who are in the current of cognition will often be the losers of arrogance. They do not see what is really happening. Manu's current can often be found even in psychotherapeutic work and in the head of the organization. As you know, I founded NPI, a corporate consultancy firm whose employees visit factories and companies to alleviate difficulties. What is such a shoulder-to-shoulder? I wanted to introduce. We were trying to help companies develop structures that don't grind employees' souls to a halt. Group work and one-to-one conversations. Employees are encouraged to keep going if the company situation may seem hopeless at the time. Unfortunately, the anthroposophical movement has understood very little of this. The greatest resistance that NPI has faced has come from the anthroposophical movement, because the work of the NPI was being destroyed by the group work is not for the self, it is for the emotional soul. When it is precisely the soul of consciousness benefits infinitely from group work. It is precisely in this often really arduous work that the conscious soul cooperation with others. Bernard Jailvgod